So now we'll move to our plenary talk for today. Our plenary speaker is Dan Egan. Dan is a former reporter at the Milwaukee Journal Sentinel, and he's currently the journalist in residence at University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee's School of Freshwater Sciences. He is the author of the well-known book and New York Times bestseller, The Death and Life of the Great Lakes. And more recently, he's just published, we'll call it a new book, called The Devil's Element, Phosphorus in a World Out of Balance. And obviously, phosphorus is something that we all think about here in the world of limnology. He is a two-time finalist for the Pulitzer Prize and winner of the LA Times Book Prize, along with many other accolades, too many to mention here. So Dan is not a scientist, he's a journalist. And he has been exceedingly successful at telling the often remarkable and engaging stories of people and water and how they're connected. And in the process of telling these stories, he's managed to share scientific knowledge with mass audiences. As a writer, Dan has a remarkable capacity to boil down complex scientific concepts and deliver them out to mass audiences. And I will say his writing is incredibly accurate. It's a delight to read. So we approached Dan to give this plenary talk. Dan was actually signed up to give the plenary for the 2020 ASLO that got canceled because of COVID, and that was to be held here in Madison. So this is a bit of a take two for Dan when it comes to the plenary. So he agreed. And we had talked about having him give a talk about communicating science to non-scientific audiences and how we might be able to get better at getting our science out of the ivory tower and expanding the audiences of our work. But he had the idea that the presentation be more of a conversation rather than just a traditional talk with PowerPoint slides. Grace and I thought this was really exciting. And so we thought, well, who better to lead Dan through the conversation about how we get out of the ivory tower than Madison's very own Andy Moore. Andy is going to kind of lead Dan through this conversation. Andy is a veteran local journalist here in Madison, and he is something of a Madison institution. He recently retired after 31 years as the senior political news producer at Wisconsin Public Television. And he has, in addition to a broadcast experience, his essays and news features appear in many local publications. He also hosts a weekly morning talk radio show on Fridays, so tomorrow morning you can listen to his show. On WORT-FM, which is a local community radio station that is extremely beloved here in Madison. So we thought Andy would be a great choice for this conversation. I am certainly looking forward to it. So please join me in welcoming our plenary speaker, Dan Egan, and we'll call him Dan's sidekick today and guide, Andy Moore. So come on up.
Morning, almost afternoon, everyone. Thank you for that nice intro, Jake. Are we good with audio, or are we all mic'd up? It's our goal to be at least as compelling as VO5's performance was on this stage last night.
We're not mic'd up.
It's not? Okay. Becca, what did we do wrong? Now we're mic'd. Yes, 31 years in television and radio. So you got a lot of confidence in this panel, I know that. As I was yelling, it's our job to be at least as compelling as VO5's performance was on this stage last night. We hope we can do that, and I also want to say that given the longevity of Dr. Sweeney's mentors, Dan, I think you and I are in the wrong business. You know, it's like, that was impressive. Let me set the table just a little bit further. Jake did a nice job. Scientists aren't the only people that get congested when they talk to the press or to authors. I've done interviews with musicians and authors themselves, who aren't exactly great at talking about what they're doing. But researchers, in our opinion, have a higher hurdle to clear because their work is so complex by definition. With that in mind, let me brief you, and I want you to listen to this out of the context of your own knowledge. Let me brief you here on what your week sounds like to a civilian, okay? Earlier this week, there was this sizzling topic, the how, when, and where of HAB prevention and mitigation, where it was mentioned that the federal government has been working on developing and vetting strategies using algicides, nanobubbles, ozonation, I can't even pronounce this stuff, UV light, flocculants, absorption, I think that might be misspelled, and biomediation. Or how about today's exploration of microbial patterns and processes along aquatic continua in the face of anthropogenic disturbances? This is, of course, where it was established that, as everyone knows, the metagenomic characterization of freshwater microorganisms along a land use gradient would provide insights on how urbanization watersheds alters microbial diversity in streams. I offer these not to diminish the importance of the work, but just to sort of set the table that I think that we collectively have our work cut out for us here in the next 40 minutes or so. Dan, a starting point, I think, is sometimes scientists are fearful. A lot of people are fearful talking to members of the press about their work. Let's just put that out there. What are the risks, as you see them, that scientists and researchers run talking to members of the press and to reporters?
Probably not as great as not talking. You know, it's really important that the work that you guys do makes its way into the public realm. And I was listening to some conferences, presentations yesterday, and I was hearing some of the same stuff, and it does, like, you guys speak in your own language to each other by necessity, just for efficiency, and so you can move through concepts quickly. But it's a different world when you're dealing with somebody as uneducated as myself. Literally, I don't have a science background. You've got to translate, or you've got to find somebody to help you translate, and that's what people like I do. The risks to this are that I will get it wrong, and I will embarrass both of us. But it's key that I said both of us, because I've got some skin in the game as well. I don't want to flub something up any more than somebody wants me to flub up their work. So how do you deal with that? It's just a matter of establishing trust, and you establish trust by being there, by showing up at people's offices, by going to conferences. I remember the first time when I covered the Great Lakes for the Milwaukee Journal Sentinel, my first real trip on this new beat was to Ennis, Ireland for the annual conference on invasive species in like 2003 or something. I was so far over my head, I didn't know, they were asking me from Milwaukee to write stories. I'm like, it's gonna take me a little while to figure this stuff out. I didn't write a great story while I was there, but I did make a lot of connections that continue to this day. So the risks are talking to somebody, explaining real quickly, and not having that person understand it, and running with the story that just makes everybody look foolish. But again, the benefits are, if it's done right, benefits are exactly what science is about, and that's advancing society.
I heard you say or suggest that journalists should be viewed, can be healthily viewed as allies, as much as an enemy to fear.
I don't think of it in terms of allies and enemies, but they are. I mean, I've worked in many newsrooms and I've seen some hacks. I have, but they typically, don't end up covering science beats. Yeah. And there's a big difference, a big distinction between covering science and covering government. There is a built-in adversarial relationship when it's the press and the government officials. It's a little stickier with science because one of the cardinal rules of journalism is you don't share your work with your sources before it's published. And I agree with that to a degree. When I don't understand something, and I've long done this and I made no bones about it in the newsroom, I would take the specific section back to the scientist and go over, am I understanding this right? I'm not trying to play got you. I'm trying to play, let's get this. Yeah. Let's get this right, and let's move it into the public sphere. So, yeah.
In my experience at PBS, many scientists and researchers on this campus, I bet there's a few here, I can't, I won't do that interview. I can't possibly explain 11 years of lab work with my team in 7 minutes. You've got to be kidding me. You've probably received some of that too, and that becomes a stopping point because there's no starting point. How can I possibly?
Yeah, you know, I actually haven't had to suffer that too much working at the Milwaukee Journal Sentinel because they did a great job of giving us time and space to tell deep stories, you know, to a broad audience. So yeah, I mean, I've listened to the radio and I've cringed, like understanding an issue, and like nobody is happy with the 90-second soundbite, if that's what a bite is. So you also have to think about your medium or your media, whatever, who you're going to work with. And I'm incredibly biased in this, but I'm all about print because it does take time to understand a lot of these complex issues, and it demands a lot of the readers, but the reader's going to get a lot more than, you know, a 20-second blurb.
There's a fear of dumbing it down sometimes among scientists.
I think of it as smarting it up.
Smarting it up.
Yeah.
Well,
I mean,
but at that fear that I can't take this on because I don't want to dumb down what I'm doing. It reminds me of a scene in the movie Philadelphia, and Denzel Washington kept telling Tom Hanks as his attorney, "Tell it to me like I'm a fourth grader." Mm-hmm. What's the difference between dumbing it down and explaining something anyone can understand?
well, I guess dumbing it down is taking shortcuts, or yeah, just taking shortcuts, maybe by necessity because of the medium that you're working in. But you don't, just because something's in the popular press doesn't mean it has to be dumbed down. And I think sometimes even the scientists that I'm working with can be surprised. It's like, yeah, I guess you can say it that way. And there's a lot of that goes on in my exchanges with people I work with. It's like, can I say this way? And I like to triangulate or quadrangulate, if that's a word, but get a number of scientists and, you know, hear what is this, bounce off certain sections of complex pieces. And it's like, does this work? Can I say this? I haven't seen anybody make this connection. Is this appropriate? And oftentimes they'll be like, yeah. And you know, again, you go to tell it to me like I'm a fourth grader. It's the exact same way you try to talk to your kids about the work you do. You know, you're not dumbing it down. You're just looking at it from a different perspective. Because again, these conferences are great for you guys to talk to each other. I mean, they're essential, but it's equally essential for what's going on in here to make its way out into the public.
Lots of times, people with studies to talk about become overwhelmed with how many things there are to explain, how many exciting things there are for the public to know. But it's okay to boil something down to one or two most important facts, is it not?
Yeah, actually, I think, you know, having constraints increases creativity. You know, I mean, just from my experience, like there's nothing more intimidating than being given 6 months to do a story, all the budget that you need, all the access. You have no excuse for it not to be the best story it could possibly be. Eventually, as you're moving through this process, people's availability drops out, deadlines shift, and you start feeling constrained. And that's where, I'm sure this happens in the scientific world, it breeds creative thought. And it actually can produce something that is better than what is intended.
Is brevity important when researchers speak on the record to the press?
Yes.
How come?
Trying to be, no, I don't think brevity. I don't think brevity is important. I mean, everybody's, you know, got a time budget, but yeah, I mean, the worst thing as the scientist you want to be doing is talking to somebody who's got to go on the air in an hour, who's got to put a story in the paper the next day. And that again goes back to the way I've been able to approach my job, thanks to the generosity of the leadership of the Milwaukee Journal Sentinel newsroom. But I come over here all the time and talk to people. It never makes it into the paper, but it enriches my understanding, and it also further establishes relationships that will be fruitful down the road. So brevity, you know, you also have to realize who you're writing for, and you know, again, the medium of radio or TV is going to be vastly different from, you know, a magazine, a newspaper article, or even a book. But no, this stuff takes time, and you got to recognize that and embrace it.
I bet some people in the room, I hope not many, have been burned by a reporter. This gets back to some of the trust issue. But let's help people recognize signs that a reporter can show a scientist, that he, she, or they know what they're doing. What should they be looking for to say, I think I can trust this guy?
Somebody who doesn't understand it right away, says, no, I'm not following that. They say there's no such thing as a dumb question, but there can be, it can happen. Or you can feel really, I almost asked the dumbest question in the world one time, and I think the person knew I was about to ask it, and we were both embarrassed. And I'll just tell you real quickly. I was up in Superior, Wisconsin, doing a story on the expansion of one of the pipelines coming in from the Western Canada. And they were showing me the dispatch center or whatever, where the oil goes in different pipes to different places. And they said, yeah, this is where we put in the pigs. I'm like, the pigs? And they said, yeah, we put them in there and they just run down the line and they can sniff out, leaks or any issues. And I'm thinking, damn. They can find truffles, And I'm like, so you put a pig in here. Where do you take it out? So any place we want. It's like, how do you know where it is? Well, there's sensors on it. And I'm just like, I'm just about to ask, like, what do they eat? When I realized that this is some kind of mechanical device, and it turns out it stands, I think, for pipe inspection gadget or something. But yeah, I mean, I've embarrassed myself a lot doing this work, and you got to be willing to do that.
Yes.
You do.
And not be afraid to say I don't understand. Back to your very first point, people know that the PBS, the famous documentarian Ken Burns, he did a documentary on baseball some time ago. He's best known for his documentary on the Civil War. But baseball was a topic we were really interested in Wisconsin, as we anticipated 2 iterations ago of the Milwaukee Brewers Stadium, and there were lots of things in the news, and we did a baseball special. And I called Ken Burns to ask if he would do an interview about his forthcoming project, baseball. Seemed like a natural thing, and I thought that would be a quick conversation, and it was, because he said, I'm not going to do that. And I said, how come? He said, because I don't know anything about baseball yet. I'm just getting started.
Yeah.
And at first I thought that was BS. But then I realized that I suppose, like for scientists, journalists carry, I think, a really important and crucial naivete.
Humility, yeah.
Which I think asks of scientists and people who are being interviewed some patience.
Yeah, it's an uncomfortable process sometimes for both sides. And I've personally found the people that, so often, this isn't universally, but the people I like working with don't really want to be talking to me. I get a little worried when you have a source who's like always trying to sell, push something on you. And, I really respect the culture of science where they want the data to do the talking, the work to do, the work. But there's a gray area in there, and it is important that it gets out. And some of my most productive relationships are with people who really don't want me calling, and I call, and I call. There's a couple names I could mention, but I won't. I'm sure that they're happy that I'm not on the daily journalism beat anymore. But yeah.
Lots of times there's things to learn when things go wrong. Scientists and journalists, I think, alike know that. So with that in mind, can you think of the most congested and useless interview with a scientist that you ever conducted?
I mean, useless to who? To me or to the scientists?
To you, because you're representing a readership, you're representing the public.
Yeah, I'd have to say, this trip that I just mentioned when I went to Ireland back in like 2003, I knew nothing about ballast water. I mean, part of this was on me for not having done more background reading. I thought I had done a fair amount, but I showed up and it was like, everybody was speaking a completely different language, And there were a couple, you know, the more intense the scientists, the nerdier the words get, and the harder it is to understand. And you know, like I said, it takes relationships and time to break through that. But when you're, you know, showing up for 6 days of this intense stuff, there were times where I just got up and walked away and thought, this can't be a news story. It's just it's too complicated. But you know, that's defeating, because you can always, if the work's worth doing, there's a story worth telling.
I think pieces of answers to this next question or in what you just said, but what are the 3 most common mistakes scientists make when communicating their work to the press?
Expecting to have complete control over how it's going to be presented, because I don't have that control. You know, it goes through editors, and then it goes through the lens of the reader too. So you've got to cede some control. So that was 1. You want 3?
Yeah.
I would say not even answering the phone. I think that's a big problem, because, you know, you like to think your work's going to speak for itself, but it doesn't always work that way. And third, not trying to understand that, or not understanding that the person, I'll use myself as an example, talking to you isn't an idiot. He's an idiot in your universe, in your world, but he's trying to be, you know, a go-between. So you need to have some patience and understand that, well, he may not know, you know, biology 101 in some ways, but he knows something I don't, and that's how to communicate this stuff. So, but mostly I think the mistake is to not talk unless you can have complete control, because nobody gets that.
A scientist asks, what's the answer? A communicator asks, what's the story? What are the ingredients to a good story?
From my medium, I mean, I think surprise, and something that sheds light on something that people think they understand. I don't know. I can't answer that. It's a hard one.
I'll take a swing at it.
Okay.
People are interested in people. You know, if there's a story that you can tie to someone in your lab that personifies what you're doing, even if it seems irrelevant to what the study is, there's a hook. People like to hear about people, and don't you think?
Oh yeah, 100%,
humanizing your work.
100%. Yeah, you know, I wrote a book about phosphorus. And you know, when I spent a few years on that, when I tell somebody I was doing it, they'd look at me like I was just diagnosed with something. And then I'd start telling some of the stories, and you know, eyes would light up. And there's always people in it. And so I work really, really hard to tell something that's entertaining. You know, it's maybe an analogy is, you know, the sugar with the medicine. You want to be helping people understand complicated things, but it's got to be done in an entertaining way. That's just our culture. That's just a reality. And so, yeah, trying to make an element phosphorus into a story is a challenge, but it, you know, to the extent that I succeeded, I'd say that it can be done, and you're absolutely right. It's done through telling the stories of people. You know how I wanted to open up this book? You don't. I'll tell you. The phosphorus was first discovered in 1679 or something like that by an alchemist in Hamburg, Germany, and he discovered it by cooking it out of his urine. He was looking for the philosopher's stone that could transmute base metals into gold and silver and whatnot. And so I thought, well, if I'm going to write a book about phosphorus, it better start out with a bang, or a whiz. A whiz. I had this idea to make my own phosphorus, and I don't have a ton of friends, but the friends I do have drink a ton of beer. So I had access to urine. I have a turkey fryer. And I had a father-in-law who's recently deceased who was a chemical engineer, and he spent his whole career working on catalysts for ammonia. And so I thought I would like cook this up in my driveway, and that would be a good way to start the book. And then I learned through more investigating and reporting that that was a fool's errand. And the closer I got to succeeding, the more likely I was to really, really hurt myself because it's very combustible. But that's not necessarily a people story, but it's humanizing it, and so that, just like you guys lose if you can't communicate to us, we lose if we can't communicate to the larger public, so, yeah.
Reminds me of a joke that we had 18 minutes. I'll tell it to you afterwards if you want to hear this. Relevance. We all assume our work is relevant, but what's a tip? What kind of strategy can you share for people to keep in mind about making their work relevant to people who aren't in their lab?
Well, I mean, if it matters to you, there's a reason, right? And so sometimes you forget the water that you're swimming in, and you just drill down so far. I'm using all these bad analogies, but if you've got to always remember what got you interested in answering this question to begin with. Why does it matter? And sometimes I think, and this can happen journalistically too, you get too close to the issue and too far into the, here I go again, into the weeds. But you can, and you got to just remind yourself, why did I think this was a good idea? Why is this going to matter? What's it going to change?
It's interesting to me because I have another question that sort of models into that. Journalists like to think in terms of hooks. Where do you hang the story? And sometimes the origin of research is a hook, an initial idea. Something as interesting as the research that follows it. Is that something for people to keep in mind? Well, you already said it. Where did this come from?
Yeah, no, I think it is. It is. It's, it's a fine line too, because you really got to drill down into what you're doing to get that work done, but you also have to be able to pop up and think to yourself at the end of the day or at the end of the week or whenever, why am I doing this? What do I hope is going to come of this?
If you can say that, you can say a lot.
Yeah.
What other hooks researchers should think about to get a reporter's attention?
I don't know. I mean, I really, just establishing relationships. I mean, because there aren't formulas for this stuff at all. I mean, if it's got you excited, help somebody else get excited about it. And it doesn't always have to be a journalist. I mean, that's just being a good communicator, which is going to matter in your career and your personal life anyway. But I'm also not a life coach, so I feel a little awkward about talking like I kind of am.
Every story needs a hero, a protagonist. This gets back to the subject of who are the people in your research, right? Who are the people not only impacted, but who are the people helping shape your science? That's part of the story that reporters and the general public also wants to know about, is it not?
Yeah. I mean, again, this gets back to personalizing what we do and humanizing it. That's as much as I got on that.
Details. What details? What is it about a detail that you choose to include in your writing?
Oh boy.
What's the qualifier for a detail?
Well, they all get used to begin with, right? And some you think are incredibly important, and they get winnowed away. All those details have to be in service of the larger story, and this will go back to just the interaction between the journalist and the scientist. It's important that you talk about more than just what you're doing at that minute. It's a relationship, and it's. The unfortunate thing right now is, I don't know if you've read the newspapers or not, going great guns. The metro, dailies have been largely gutted. So this is a challenging time for everybody. on the optimistic side of things, the people who are still doing it, I think, are often, really into it. They're not getting compensated handsomely by any stretch, and they're not circulating like the Metro dailies used to be able to. But yeah, I mean, it's important to cultivate relationships with reporters that you trust. You're both gonna benefit from that, and it doesn't have to be one either. I mean, and this will gets back to like, how do you figure out who to trust? And it just takes time, and talking about things that may not seem that like they matter at the moment, but.
We have a few minutes left, and in that time, by and large, science is about our personal and planetary well-being. In the end, what is the value of including emotion in the telling of your science?
Well, I think that helps communicate. Like when I wrote that Great Lakes book, I had no idea how much I loved the Great Lakes so I grew up in Green Bay, Wisconsin, and I went out west after college, and I worked at newspapers in Idaho and Salt Lake and Wyoming. And I was out there for 10 years, and there's nothing like living in a desert for 10 years and then coming back to the Great Lakes, or to a pretty good lake like this. But really, the Great Lakes, you see them in a whole different perspective. And I wasn't hired to cover the Great Lakes. I was hired to be a feature writer. But I just realized that those, growing up in Green Bay, you're right on the Bay of Green Bay in Arma Lake, Michigan. I was fortunate enough to have 2 sets of grandparents who had summer cottages up on the Door Peninsula, so I spent a lot of time up there. And I was just, I was 23 years younger when I came back here, so I was still pretty young, but I didn't realize what an impression, what an emotional tie I had to those lakes. And I really believe that comes out in that book, in the organization of it, in the details of it, in the arc of it. I mean, it meant something to me, and I didn't know that was the case when I first moved back here and started writing about the lakes.
Dan Egan, 3 most important things to keep in mind when talking with a journalist.
3 in one time. Well, I mean, as I said before, they're not necessarily dumb, even if they are dumb in your universe. Take as much time as you have, and then we're going right back to it again, but acknowledge that you're not going to have complete control. But once you do find somebody that works with you, and once you figure out how that worked, you can work on that with other reporters as well. It really is, it's just a messy relationship that we have where, they're 2 different worlds, but I think it's essential for the work being done here and for the general public that those worlds brush up against each other, and that's what we do.
Was that 3?
Yeah.
Or maybe more.
No, if you have one too, I mean,
Well, I guess I could go there. I guess I'll second.
It's not so easy, is it?
No, it's not, yeah. So we have 10 minutes and 30 seconds left, so I think I'll tell the joke. It's the only water joke I know, and it's my good friend Buzzy and Frank were out on Lake Monona fishing, and out in the middle in their little boat, and a bottle floated by, and Buzzy says to Frank, "Hey, grab that bottle. There might be a genie in it." And Frank grabs the bottle, and sure enough, the genie pops out and says, "You got one wish, only one wish." So Buzzy says, "I wish that all the water in this lake would be replaced with beer." And the genie waves his arms, and all the water is turned into beer. And Frank says, "Oh, great, Buzzy. Now where are we going to piss?" So we have 9 minutes and 45 seconds left. 44 seconds left for questions for Dan Egan. I know that people might have a question to follow up on what I hope was some light on the topic of this relationship, such as Dan calls it. Yes?
Let's see if I can get this to work. There, now it's on. So I'm reminded of something. There's this blue-green background, blue and green background behind you, and you mentioned control. That we can't expect it, that you don't have it. The thing that I think that stops a lot of scientists from talking to journalists is when we read articles and they're just little things that are wrong. Like someone will say, to the average person, blue, green, and green algae, it's just a color, what does that mean? But in our world, there's a huge difference. And I guess I don't understand. I'd always been told that it was because of deadlines, not because of not talking to your sources, why we can't just at the very end, like, check, good. Like, that's what that's the way we work in science.
Yeah, no, I appreciate everything that you said. And, I have the same question sometimes too. As I mentioned earlier, there's a big difference between covering a politician and covering a scientist. One of them is we speak the same language as politicians, and we don't speak the same language as you just mentioned with the blue-green and the green algae. I personally, if I don't know that it's right, I'm gonna make sure it's right. I've made plenty of mistakes. I'm not saying I don't, but that's my philosophy. And I think that, it's not unreasonable to say to the reporter, like, I know this is complicated stuff, and I know this isn't my story, this is your story. But we both want to get it right. It's, if the reporter's worth his or her salt, they want that too. And that's when I said it gets like a little messy, because this takes more time. And when you got the radio station calling you on deadline, I guess the advice is to just keep it as simple as possible and to focus on the why does this matter, not the nitty-gritties, the ahas that really light you guys up, but aren't going to be seen as such or heard as such on a 30-second radio piece. But that's a good question, and it's a good one to ask the journalist. Why can't I? And say, I'm not trying to control it. I'm just trying to quality control it.
Maybe over here?
Yeah, thank you so much for your talk. It was really interesting. I kind of had a question about, I think there are a lot of caveats in science, and maybe caveats isn't quite the right word, but as a young scientist, I'm very aware of the fact that I maybe don't have all of the knowledge that I need in order to make some of these definitive statements about my research that might make it a compelling story. And I think that can kind of lose track of the overarching arc and the final message that we want to convey. And I was wondering if you had any advice for us about that, because science can change, and I'm a little aware of that fact.
That seems to be something that's going to happen on your side of the journalistic equation. It's you working within your community. You work with your people, your professors, your mentors. It's like, can we go here? Can we do this? Are we ready to do this? Am I going to go out and say this? And right now I'm talking about more in the medium of faster paced journalism. But I would, as a scientist, I'd be scared to working with a young scientist and a young reporter are probably in some pretty fraught territory, and it's best that both sides work with their bosses and go forward. You want to light the world on fire as a scientist, a young scientist, and same thing with a journalist. And as the older you get, the more you realize that this stuff doesn't happen fast, and if it does, it's often not good. Thank you.
Okay, over on this side maybe?
Yeah, thanks for an interesting discussion. And if I look at ASLO and what we've done over the last 10, 20, even 30 years, we've emphasized outreach, better communication to non-scientific audiences. SciComm is a buzzword that there's always a workshop about. And last time I checked, communication is not one way. And I think about how synthetic your books are, and it's clear that there's two things that you're good at. One is engaging with the communities that you're representing and trying to understand, and the other is you're a good listener. And my question is, are we not emphasizing engagement skills and listening skills within the scientific community? Because right now it's really about how do we make a better fire hose to talk about ourselves. And I think we're distinctly limited to have impact because of that if we don't learn how to be better engagers and better listeners.
Yeah, you know, this goes to this built-in tension. I think that, you know, there can be resentment sometimes in the scientific community if, like, a scientist goes out, especially a young scientist, goes out and writes a book on this stuff, right? And they're thinking, the community may be thinking, well, who are you to carry that mantle or to grab that microphone? I don't know if I'm answering your question.
I guess my question is, scientists should be able to learn from the stakeholders that they're presumably trying to provide information to. And I don't think we train our scientists to become good at engaging with those other sectors of society and also listening to the point where we can learn from them and refine our science as a result.
Yeah, and that is as much of a statement as anything, and I agree with that, you know. But our minds work differently too. You know, I'm a soft-minded fellow, if you will, not hard science. And, you know, there's just going to be some friction there. You know, there's always going to be some friction. You guys aren't great communicators, but you're great at, you know, discovering things. And we're good at, if we're doing our job right, we're good at putting that in the context. So I think it's good that you take the effort to try to have that communication channel established with, you know, the public, but also you got to know who you are and what your limitations are too. You know, it's hard to be, you know, there's certain scientists that you can think of who wrote great books, but there's not a lot of them. And, you know, they often, you know, probably did it toward the end of their career where they had a lot of time to reflect and maybe some help crafting it.
Let's go over to this side, that mic.
Thank you. Dan, I just want to say, first off, really enjoy your books. Great writing, from Milwaukee originally, so big fan of the Journal Sentinel also. And I also want to say thank you for the insights you provided today, coming from the journalist side of things to the scientists. As kind of mentioned, we don't get a whole lot of that. I work for the city of Austin. I do 10 to 15 interviews a year. And initially it was kind of brought to me, you know, how to be kind of on guard, or PIO, you know, be careful what you say. Everything gets turned into and distilled to a soundbite. But to your points, over the past decade, I've been able to build some really good relationships with some of the journalists. They take the time, and I'll take the time kind of giving up that control thing. I know I'm going to get a very small soundbite at the end of the day, but I try to spend the time with them to give them as much context as possible. But a lot of what you said today was great information to take back to, you know, hopefully be better in communicating the science. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you. And, you know, I'll say from my perspective, or from the journalistic perspective, you know, really appreciate when you guys are willing to put your neck out there a little bit, because what you're doing matters so much. It's not like a Packer game, you know, where you're getting a soundbite and, you know, maybe that's out of context or something. Well, it's just a game, but this isn't.
I hate to pull it to the curb, especially with so many hands still in the air, as it were. But we are out of time. I know Dan has his books, right?
The phosphorus book I have.
The phosphorus
Yep.
book he has with him, and you'll be set up maybe.
Yes, in the ASLO booth.
And to make some big cash.
Cash and
Venmo.
And Venmo.
Okay, all right.
I don't know. It's my daughter's doing it.
Yeah, all right. Okay. Well, everybody, Dan Egan.
Thank you. Thanks, Andy.
Yeah, you're welcome.
That was great.
Well, thank you, Dan and Andy, for a great conversation. We really appreciated that. Just a few announcements from us before you head off for lunch. We don't mean to, you know, hold you back, but.
Yes, again, reminder, of course, lunch is on your own, and you can see the rooftop terrace. Local Guides to Madison is on the app. Check out the Student Member Benefits Lunch Workshop that's happening in the community terrace, also where the Drawing Water exhibit is located. Stop by the poster hall this evening. We had great attendance on Tuesday. Hope to see you again this evening. We also invite you to attend the ASLO Rainbow Reception from 5:30 to 6:30, I believe. Nope, 7:30 to 8:30. Math. On the community terrace. That's going to be a networking and building in a safe and welcoming environment for LGBTQIA+ scientists and allies. Woo. Also, if you're interested in purchasing Dan Egan's most recent book, they'll be available at the ASLO booth immediately following here, 12:30 to 1, and Dan will be present to sign copies. I hope you have a fantastic lunch, and we'll see you back here this afternoon.